Good morning, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order. We have quorum, yes. I would like to give a warm welcome to members of the public and those watching live online or in television. As usual, I'd like to remind everyone that you can find the agenda for today's meeting and follow the meeting in real time at www.toronto.ca/council. Any declarations of interest to be declared under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Members of the committee? None declare. Motions to confirm the minutes of October 22nd, 2015. Councillor Di Giorgio, you can see that he's putting his hand up. All those in favor? Against? Carried. Thank you. We have 3 items in today's agenda. We're going to go through it briefly, and I will hold those items that have speakers. We have item 1, we have speakers, so this item is going to be held. Item 2, it's held. And we have also a presentation item 2, and we have a presentation item 3. So all the items. There's no presentation. No presentation. We don't have. Okay. So it's. So we have 2, and item 3. The recommendations at this point is to receive this item for information. Are we okay with that? And this is the work plan for 2016 and 2018. And briefly speaking, that we have had this situation for some time, that we have more than 130 items, I believe, that we have to deal with. And the number of requests for reports keep on increasing. And we have items that go back to 2010. So I did meet as chair with city staff, and it was recommended that to bring forward this work plan as we move forward, so we know exactly when those items are going to come forward within the next few months. So that gives the level of direction that needs to be done. So that's the purpose of this report. Having said that, if anyone has any questions, we can hold that item. Otherwise, we can just receive.
I just have one quick question, Mr. Chairman.
So and then the item will be held.
Questions of staff that maybe we can address offline. So why don't we just hold it and see what happens?
Let's hold it.
So we hold the item just for
Question of staff.
questions. Absolutely. Thank you. So the item is going to be held. Great. We also have some communications from Councillor Michael Thompson. We also have a legal opinion from Liz White, Director of Animal Service Canada, and a legal opinion from Simon Shields, and that's with item 8.1 that has to do with the licensing of wildlife control operators. So I will suggest that these communications be part of that item. Do we need a motion for that? No, we don't. No, so that will be part of it. So, and we also have a communication as a walk-on item from Councillor Karygiannis. And what I would like to suggest is that before we entertain that one, that be distributed to the members of the committee for the information, and we'll deal with that a little bit later. Is that okay? Vice Chair, are you okay with that? Great. Okay, fantastic. Let's move on. Item 1, we'll go straight to the petitions now.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, on
Yes.
a point of order, I thought Councillor Karygiannis wanted to introduce a motion. Are we doing these at the beginning of the meeting?
No, my suggestion is for his communication to be distributed to the clerk and through the clerk to all the members of the committee, so we'll have an opportunity to read, and then we'll introduce it later.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you.
In answer to
Councillor De Beermakers, I've talked to staff and they're helping me draft something.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. First item, we'll go to deputations now. The first deputant is Nathalie Carbone, Executive Director of Toronto Wildlife Centre. Good morning, good to have you here. Have 5 minutes, please go ahead.
Morning. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Carvonen, and I'm a biologist. I'm also the founder and executive director of Toronto Wildlife Centre. You should have a handout for me as well, just a one-pager. A little bit about Toronto Wildlife Centre. We've been open, helping the public since 1993. We're the busiest wildlife centre in Canada. Every single day, we respond to calls from the public on our wildlife hotline, including many calls about conflict situations between people and wildlife. Toronto 311 directs calls to our hotline every day, and Toronto Wildlife Centre has published the first and only Wildlife Hotline Manual, a 500-page peer-reviewed publication being used around the world to train others to educate the public about conflict situations with wildlife and other wildlife issues. The first 100 copies were purchased by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. We know a lot about the issue of living with wildlife in the City of Toronto, the experience that the public have and report to us, their need for quality help, and the problems with the unregulated wildlife control industry, an industry where anyone in this room could go out tomorrow and start selling their services to the unsuspecting public. Councillor Matlow, you could have Josh Matlow's squirrel removal service. You can hang a shingle out tomorrow and start your work and no one would stop you. I'm here today to strongly encourage the licensing of wildlife control operators, an important step that will help ensure the humane treatment of the wild animals that share our beautiful city, a city filled with green spaces and wildlife habitat. And it will help ensure that the public who assume this industry is being regulated, being treated fairly, not charged exorbitant fees for concerns that are not dealt with appropriately. The wildlife control industry is one that desperately needs licensing. Although there are currently a handful of reputable, knowledgeable companies, most are not. Common problems with practices they carry out include the orphaning of a lot of babies each year in the City of Toronto, by trapping and relocating their mothers, or practices that separate the families by other means. These babies then either suffer or die slowly, sometimes not found for days or even a week without care by their mothers, and then are brought to wildlife rehabilitators for care if we have room and resources to accept them. When wildlife rehabilitators are not able to accept all of these babies created by the wildlife control industry, then the city are the ones that have to pick up the slack. Toronto Animal Services responds to a lot of these calls each year, and I'm sure that Toronto Animal Services and Toronto Wildlife Centre experience the same thing with upset, sobbing, distressed members of the public who have now babies that have been orphaned, and there's nowhere for them to go for help. This is a very serious problem, and members of the public are extremely unhappy about this situation. Trapping and relocating of adult wild animals is another issue with the wildlife control industry. It's a common practice, despite it being illegal to move them more than 1 kilometer. And studies show that animals that are moved out of their home territory don't do well. One study showed that up to 70% of raccoons moved out of their home territory were dead in the first 3 months after being hit by cars or attacked by other animals in an attempt to get back home again. And then lastly, it is a really big concern that people are just being ripped off left, right, and center by these companies. People who, for example, an elderly person with no family to help them with a situation on their property would call one of these companies, assuming that they're regulated by someone, and be charged a lot of money for a solution that is usually not a long-term solution to the problem. We hear from those people as well. Although it has been suggested that this type of licensing should be the responsibility of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, wildlife control operators also work with many species that are not protected provincially. They're protected federally or unprotected. Some of these examples include Canada geese, mallards, or robins, which are federally protected, or pigeons, starlings, crows, and groundhogs, which are unprotected, so are not under the jurisdiction of the province at all. In fact, there are 440 species of wildlife in Ontario, and only 30% are protected provincially. Wildlife control operators also carry out some activities that cannot currently be regulated under the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act. For example, the use of one-way doors, or plain old just pulling a nest of babies out of a stove vent and throwing them onto the ground. That's not regulated either. I can't understand how it would be possible for the provincial government to regulate an industry that deals with species and activities that they are not responsible for. So in conclusion, I again urge you to please vote to license these companies at the municipal level. As I mentioned, the public already assumes that they are regulated by someone. It would be extremely helpful for the public, preventing them from being ripped off and actually creating situations where they could have long-term solutions to problems. It would prevent cruelty and suffering of native wild animals, and it would conserve your own resources as the City of Toronto from having to deal with the problems created by a lot of these companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Di Vermeeke.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for coming in today. Sir, how long have you been in the, I'll call it the saving of wildlife business?
Myself,
Yes, roughly.
about 30 years.
So 3 decades. And roughly how many wild animals go through your facility at Downsview Park per year as a ballpark?
About 5,000.
About 5,000
That's all we can manage.
And how many different species would that be roughly?
Over 270 different species.
And if you were to close your doors tomorrow because your charity can raise the money to keep your doors open, where do you think those 5,000 animals a year would go?
I would imagine Toronto Animal Services would be called and have to decide if they could respond to those additional animals. There isn't another wildlife center in the City of Toronto.
And I'm sure you're aware that our staff would say if a white-tailed deer is injured or a coyote is injured or even a Canada goose is injured, I don't think Toronto Animal Services has the facilities to care for those and rehabilitate those animals. Am I correct?
Toronto Animal Services or other municipal animal services around the GTA don't have the license or permits or facilities to do wildlife rehabilitation.
Okay. And I think you summed it up very well at the end of your presentation. So you think in terms of we as a council protecting members of the public, so based on your 30 years of experience, you support licensing of wildlife operators?
Absolutely. It's a huge problem for so many different reasons, for
And you
people
think
and
that'll-
animals.
In terms of public safety, you think that would increase public safety?
Probably. I think a lot of the times when people call around to some of these companies and don't have a good solution, they will try to take matters into their own hands if they're being faced with a bill of, say, $1,000. So they could be, up on rooftops or handling animals that they're not trained to handle in those situations.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Karygiannis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming.
You're
We were having a conversation in relation to a Carboni that works in our city.
Albert Carbonen?
No, it's a lady. Juliana?
No, don't know her.
Thank you, Councillor. It was a situation that I had at my mom's home, and we thought there was some raccoons up in the attic. So we called a company to come, and they worked on it, and they gave us a bill that ended up being about $500. I'm not sure if that was the right amount or the wrong amount. If you license somebody, number one, would fees go up in these companies, or would you be looking for the city also to have a guideline of set fees that they would be charging for different services that they provide?
It's not really an area that I'm familiar with, how licensing impacts fee structures. I mean, I certainly know that there's lots and lots of people who want to be in this business, so I would imagine just the competitive nature would keep fees reasonable in that case. I think one of the concerns that we've always seen is that even if people pay $500 or $1,000 right now, it often doesn't result in a solution to the problem.
Would you suggest that we might want to, say, set fees for this service you charge so much, this service you charge so much? Because you do have elderly folks that sometimes just, don't go on the internet to find out, do not call a lot of places. Would that be something that your organization might support, that, there's just set fee for doing the work?
I think if that's consistent with what's done with other licensed businesses, then yes, that we would support that. I think it is definitely an issue for people like, as you say, the elderly or people who have lower incomes, that these fees can be quite expensive. So I would support that.
Would the industry or the organization be willing or suggesting maybe that there's some rules and regulations, or I'm not sure if they exist, where, I'm asking that people that want to do wildlife removal or preservation, that they, either, your organization or somebody similar to you can give them a couple of days training, how to handle it. I mean, not everybody gets in a business that they know how to do it. Some people might want some training or some manuals or some sort of, like online work. Would something like that be supportive by you?
Absolutely. We'd be happy to be involved in that because, not only is it part of our mission, our mandate to educate about wildlife issues, but we have to deal with the repercussions of operators who are making mistakes and who don't know what they're doing or who don't care what they're doing. But if I can just add too, I think that Brad Gates is also going to be coming up from AAA Gates Wildlife Control, and he might be able to address some of these questions as well with respect to the fees.
Today, is there an existence like a course or that it's either online or community college or some organization gives in teaching people how to do it, how to make sure that we're kind to the animals, we don't injure them? Is there anything like that out there?
There have been a variety of training workshops and training courses over the years that I've known about, and I think, again, AAA Gates has actually run some of those courses themselves. I know that there have been some American operators who have come up to train here in Toronto with Mr. Gates' company. Whether or not that's exactly what the city wants, it could form the basis of
On
it.
that, would you be able to tell us in other jurisdictions, what is taking place, that regulations exist? Do they have, are they self-taught? Is there a regulatory body? Are there cities that look after this? I mean, how does it work, let's say, in other cities, that regulations does exist, or other states, or other provinces?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that. I haven't looked into that.
We will be able to.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
The next deputant is Robin Harwat. Followed by Bill Davis and Liz White after.
Thank you,
Morning.
Mr. Chairman and committee. Thank you for allowing us to present today on LS 8.1. On behalf of the Ontario Fur Managers Federation, we'd like to thank you for allowing us the opportunity to speak to you regarding the licensing of wildlife control operators. OFMF understands that this committee needs to make sure that the residents of Toronto and the wildlife are looked after legally and properly. We would like to point out that there are 3 provincial agencies that have legislation, regulation, and enforcement branches that are responsible for both the wildlife and the public in Ontario. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry are the competent authority in Ontario that regulate how wildlife can be handled, relocated, or dispatched humanely by any individual, business, or organization. They also have over 200 enforcement officers to enforce the laws and ensure that these activities are legally, humanely carried out in the rural and municipal jurisdictions in Ontario. The Ontario Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the OSPCA, also enforces legislation and laws regarding the inhumane treatments of animals and wildlife. In Toronto, enforcement is conducted by the Toronto Humane Society and/or the OSPCA. They also have officers that enforce and ensure that wildlife is protected in Ontario and that individuals or businesses in violation are charged and prosecuted. The Ministry of Government and Consumer Services is the provincial agency that protects residents of Ontario from misrepresentation or fraudulent activities by individuals and businesses in Ontario. Complaints regarding business practices are under their jurisdictions, and consumers may also access accreditation agencies such as the Better Business Bureau. Concerns with the activities of wildlife control operators can be and are addressed through these existing agencies and can result in removal of licenses, fines, and/or charges. The OFMF does not believe licensing wildlife control operators, whether individuals or businesses in Toronto, will have any added effect on protecting wildlife or residents beyond what is currently in place. The OFMF believes that the city would be better served by educating the public on what rules govern wildlife control and what factors to consider when hiring a wildlife control operator. The OFMF would like to make the committee aware that there is already a provincial body that governs and licenses individuals wanting to remove or harvest fur bearers in Ontario. Individuals that are resident of Canada who have successfully completed the mandatory 40-hour fur harvest fur management conservation course that is accredited and approved by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry can apply for a license. This license gives the individual permission to trap in a designated area in Ontario, but also the individual is an agent of the Crown, which gives them the authority to remove nuisance wildlife in Ontario. This license is approved by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and is issued by the OFMF on behalf of the MNRF in Ontario. The Ontario Fur Managers Federation also is the body that delivers the training for instructors and delivery of the Fur Harvest Fur Management Conservation course by authority of the Ministry of Natural Resources. The Ontario Fur Managers recommends to the committee that any individual involved in removing, relocating, or dispatching defined nuisance wildlife in Toronto be required to provide proof of having completed the mandatory 40-hour fur harvest fur management conservation course and be in possession of a current valid Ontario trapping license. The Ontario Fur Manager recommends to the committee that this license is the only license that is required and should give the committee the confidence that the residents of Toronto and wildlife are provided the protection they deserve. If the committee recommends any course or workshop to be mandatory for wildlife control in Toronto, it must be recognized and be approved by the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Government of Ontario. It also should be mandatory that the instructors or presenters of such a workshop or course be approved and appointed by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry for Ontario. We'd like to remind the committee that they should not restrict any legal tools or methods that would humanely deal with removal of wildlife, whether it is relocation or legal dispatch, or would cause any hardships or safety concerns for residents of Toronto in dealing with the problems they have encountered. The Ontario Fur Managers would also like to remind the committee that all traps and live holding devices that are used for wildlife removal in Ontario must be certified and approved by the Ministry of Natural Resources under their legislative authority. To qualify, these devices have had to be tested to meet the Agreement for International Humane Trapping Standards, which is an international agreement between Canada, Russia, and the European Union. The Ontario Fur Managers have provided each of the committee members of copies of brochures that we have produced by the OFMF to educate the public and trappers. We are constantly working on best methods for best management practices for wildlife and brochures to ensure humane wildlife trapping methods and to help the public avoid humane wildlife issues. In closing, we hope that we have offered your committee recommendations and solutions that will help in managing the overabundance of wildlife in Toronto and protecting the residents of Toronto. The Ontario Fur Managers are willing to work with your staff and animal services in any way that we can. Thank you again for allowing us
Thank you.
presentation.
Any questions?
Sure.
Vice Chair Karygiannis?
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I've asked the question before, and maybe when your deputation, you might answer it. If you have, I apologize for asking it again. Would you recommend that there's a set rules of fees that, like, if I want to, remove the raccoons from my attic, that I know a ballpark figure what the charges would be, or other sets of services?
I think for the residents of Toronto that you would have to set some sort of guideline to it, but also with the democracy that we live in and people to be allowed to conduct their business in that, you have to be careful. I would hate to see fees rise because some operators that are providing a service to people that are more affordable than others would cause them, as we heard earlier, to possibly take things into their own hands. And I think Toronto has experienced that already, where people who are barely able to exist can't afford exorbitant fees. So I think you need to be careful with that.
Would you recommend self-regulation where it's licensed and then maybe we can work with a body that it self-regulates, and if there's any complaints that maybe that particular body would be able to handle it? Or would you want the city to look after it?
Go ahead.
My concern with self-regulation is it doesn't become a self-conservation thing. And what I mean by that is that if I'm on the regulatory body and I have a business and you're my competition and I can find some way of getting you out,
Okay.
that I would maybe direct my efforts towards that. So Going back to it being a free market, there's nothing wrong with recommending a fee structure, but in the city, which this is my hometown, I don't live here now, but my dad built at 401 and Yonge. The housing here started way, way long ago, so what somebody would run into a new construction area is not what somebody may run into an old construction area. So to set an exact fee, I mean, it's the same as an electrician, that's what my dad was. You don't know what you're going to get into until you're actually into the job. So to restrict somebody at a top level is very difficult for a business.
Complaints that might arise from services, should there be, should the city be handling them, or, and again, this is where I go back to the self-regulatory body.
I have a couple of businesses, and we deal with the Better Business Bureau and with the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. Even though those people exist, or those associations exist, it never, there is no guarantee of a bad operator. And we've used the example of the boating license, which some may or may not have an example to. I can spend a half an hour on a computer, my 12-year-old kid can, and he can be a boater. Or somebody can come up with me who's boated all my life up on the Muskoka Lakes, and my child would probably be better trained at 8 years old than somebody who finishes the boating course. And I only say that to say that just because somebody completes a course, and our executive director has been through the course with that, the fellow come up from the States with, Robin will know the exact name of it, and when he reported back to us, he felt that it was extremely inadequate, at that there was absolutely no hands-on thing in a day and a half. So it didn't give him any more knowledge than what he had before.
Would you be, I've only got 45 seconds. My last question to you is there other cities that have such a regime, and how do they handle it, like regulations, training?
There's nobody else that we know of that's licensing,
In North America, nowhere?
not in Ontario anyway, and not in Canada. Robin belongs to the FIC, so, which is the First Institute of Canada. He could.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just answer one further to his question there. The course from NACOA in the States, they've worked 14 years, the University of Nebraska, on getting a wildlife course such as Toronto is looking at here in 50 states. And at this point, they have only, in 14 years, got 20 states to take on that training component in that course that they offer.
Thank you. Any other further questions? If not, thank you.
Thank you.
Bill Davis.
I was with Robin, so.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next deputant is Liz White, followed by Brad Gates. Good morning, Ms. White. Good to have you here.
Good morning, and thank you very much for allowing us to talk today. My recommendation to you is to vote in favor of licensing wildlife removal companies. And I'm going to add one other thing, which is to request that you consider prohibiting the use of body gripping traps in Toronto as a method of removing animals for a whole variety of different reasons. Just in addressing the issues that were raised the last time, we've had a number of legal opinions, which I think has been circulated to you. It's in the back of my report, to say that there is absolutely no conflict between the City of Toronto licensing wildlife removal companies with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act and regulations attached. It simply adds to, but does not conflict or frustrate the Act in any way. So I think you ought to consider those legal opinions as a way of looking at this. In addition, the recommendation to ban traps, body gripping traps, addresses issues of public safety and humane issues regarding the use of these devices in dense urban environments. So the question is, why is it important for the city to do this? There are a number of operators that exist with no regulations at all, and residents are at risk of hiring people who don't know what they're doing, which may cause damage to their houses and certainly will often cause damage to the animals that they're dealing with. Two of us who wrote this report are members of the Human-Wildlife Conflict Advisory Group. And at the very beginning of that group, we advised the Minister of Natural Resources on how to reduce human-wildlife conflicts in Ontario. And in the course of that, the very first item we did was looking at licensing wildlife removal companies. And the committee voted unanimously to ask the minister to consider doing it. And the government said no. So the ministry is, as far as I know, is not going to license wildlife removal companies themselves, even though it's within their jurisdiction to do so. So we're left with a great big void and no way of dealing with it. It's really interesting. I went back through my notes, and I was at the Board of Health in December 1998, and in that meeting, there were two items that were on that agenda: wildlife removal companies and leg hold traps and body gripping traps, a consideration on a ban. So we're talking about 17 years later, having been at another committee like this in 2014 and through umpteen dozen conversations with the Ministry of Natural Resources, and we are still in a position of not having a license for wildlife removal companies, and the same and constant complaints that come not only just from residents, but if you talk to the region and the Conservation Authority in Toronto, you will find that they are finding raccoons being dumped down on the Leslie Street spit, which is having significant impact on black-crowned night heron nests. So we have a problem in Toronto with companies that are just going about their business. On the issue of body gripping traps, there are three pictures in your package. The first is one that was done by the Toronto Sun a number of years ago. I can't remember the date of it. It's a picture of a young raccoon with a leg hold trap on its face. It was in the City of Toronto and resulted in a number of conversations with municipal governments about what to do about these devices. The second is a picture of a snapping turtle. This was just last year. That was caught in a conibear trap in the Hamilton Conservation Authority area. You can see that the trap, well, the animal died, but it was obviously not the target species. So that was a more recent one. And then the third one is a picture of a memorial to Harper, who was a little dog in Guelph, who was on off-leash park and stuck his head through a hole in the fence and got caught in a conibear trap and died. And that resulted in a bylaw in Guelph to ban the use of leg hold and body gripping traps. So at the end of the day, I hope after 17 years of talking about this, that the committee might actually consider passing a motion to license them and ban body gripping traps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. White. Any questions? Thanks so much
Perfect.
for the
Thank
presentation.
you.
Brad Gates.
Chair, can I
Good morning. Good to have you here.
respectfully ask a few minutes to get a PowerPoint presentation up?
By all means, please. Let me know when you're ready.
Thank you. Okay, I'm ready to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
My name is Brad Gates. I'm the owner and president of Gates Wildlife Control. My company has been servicing the residents of Toronto for over 31 years. I'm here to express my support for the need of licensing of wildlife control operators in the City of Toronto. What is causing the crisis in all municipalities in Ontario, as far as I know, is the lack of government regulation makes it easy to start up with any skills or training. Any individual can walk into a Home Depot, buy a trap, and call themselves a wildlife control operator, and then to begin to service the public. Inadequate experience means new operators are learning by trial and error. Consumers are suffering from this, and the animals are suffering from this. Consumer protection is being put at risk, public health is being put at risk, and animal welfare is being put at risk. What Steven Spielberg was able to make people afraid of sharks, wildlife control operators are doing to make people afraid of raccoons. Fear-mongering is a big part of their sales strategy. More prevalent than ever before, wildlife operators are using fear to instill a sense of urgency and promote work that is simply not required. And this uncalled practice is gaining them service fees 5 to 10 times more than should be charged for this service. In August of last year, an 88-year-old man was taken for $23,000 by a contractor who convinced him that he had raccoons in his attic. We were called out to look at the situation. This gentleman never had a raccoon in his attic from the very get-go, and the contractor did substandard work trying to reinforce the beams in the attic, which we took video and pictures of. The gentleman responsible for this has been charged with fraud. And this is the first case of fraud in my 31 years that I've heard of where an individual has been charged through a wildlife removal process. In September of the same year, 2014, a 97-year-old was taken for $2,160. Councillor Michael Thompson got in touch with our company, and we assisted in solving the problem at no charge for the homeowner. I took out a few examples of quotes of reviews that were on the internet that are from customers that have hired irresponsible wildlife removal companies. I have 3 of them. I'd just like to read them to you. The estimate was $3,800 to seal up all entry holes, 2 workers for 8 hours, $205 an hour. Other companies said the work recommended was not necessary. He told us it was a disaster in the attic. He kept telling us how much of a safety issue it was for our toddler. He was laying on the fear factor really thick. The total quote was $5,500. And my last quote, I felt the people of this company were rude and unreliable. They did not get rid of the squirrel problem. It cost over $500 after all said and done, and nothing was accomplished. Public health is a serious concern with respect to information being shared by wildlife removal companies to homeowners. This is a picture of raccoon feces on a deck. Raccoons have a worm that lives in their intestines and sheds the eggs of this worm into the feces. If accidentally ingested, more likely by a young child, this disease can be very serious and cause serious neurological disease and or death. An example of a situation I ran across, a company previous to mine came out, looked at this situation. This is a child soother on a pile of feces in a window well. The representative of this company failed to tell the consumer that this was a very dangerous situation. When I arrived, I immediately removed that soother in the event that the child had come out and wanted to retrieve it. He could have come down with this disease. Another situation is wildlife removal companies are removing feces from attics. They're dragging these vacuum hoses through the inside of the house over top of feces, potentially contaminating the inside of the house and affecting the residents. They also use these large bags on the outside to contain the feces that's been vacuumed up. These are porous bags that can potentially put the egg into the environment and affect passerbys or people with windows open. I do have some graphic images to show you with respect to animal welfare. I'll warn you of that. Most wildlife removal companies do not follow up on jobs. They set traps or one-way doors on points of entry and assume that the job is done. Follow-ups are very important because our business is not an exact science. This is a picture of a squirrel that was left to die inside of a trap. The trap was set and never returned to. Companies are using devices that aren't meant for wildlife control. This is a rat trap used on a red squirrel. The homeowner said they heard this animal for 1 hour moving about with the trap locked onto its neck. This is an example of a device we took off of a house, of a metal spiked one-way door. It's meant to allow the animal from the inside to push its way out, but trying to get back inside, it's supposed to poke the animal in the face and prevent it from getting in. If a mother raccoon had babies inside this attic, she would die trying to go through that device to get inside. This is another more common type of one-way door that's a spiked, where an animal is supposed to be able to push its way out but not back in. There's no telling how big the raccoon in the attic could be, so you can never design this to work effectively. And this is a case where a raccoon simply got impaled in its attempt to get through a much too small opening. So how is the public affected? Just to sum up, the public is affected by incompetent advice, fear-mongering, poor work quality, undue stress, loss of money, and disease exposure. The last point I'd like to make is that I did obtain a legal opinion from Gartner and Kostanska, and their opinion, and they cited some previous cases that in fact supported this, that any municipality is permitted to enact legislation insofar as such legislation does not conflict with provincial or federal legislation. And that is not at all our intention. We want to complement what is already in existence as far as the organizations such as the OSPCA, the Ministry of Natural Resources, and any police department that deals with fraud. Thank you for your time.
Councilor Janis? I think you asked for it. Okay. So, Councilor De Bremique?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for coming today. We also have a letter from Orkin Canada in support of licensing the industry. So would you call your organization or your business one of the best in the business? And maybe it's a biased question, but you're maybe one of the best known?
We probably are the best known and certainly one of the longest lived businesses in this industry.
And do you think you and Orkin and other industry companies would be willing to work with our staff to make sure, you've already helped us with a training course at no charge, design the training course at no charge, hold it in a building like this where we don't have to pay rent to minimize costs?
100%. And we do have the support of other competitors, if you will, that are willing to get behind this licensing concept.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? If not, thank you for your presentation. Thanks so much. The next deputant is Julie Udier. Yeah, you can use that one. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I'm Julie Whittier. I work with ZooCheck, but I also was an SPCA agent for a number of years earlier in my career, and I was also the chair of a wildlife rehabilitation center north of Toronto. I can tell you very specifically that during my time as an SPCA agent, I had to respond to the kinds of calls that Mr. Gates just showed you, where animals were injured or dead in traps. And there is no ability under the Ontario SPCA Act or Criminal Code of Canada to adequately address these, because you have to be able to prove willful neglect, that the individual knew the animal was suffering at the time. And as he mentioned, the animals are trapped, the trap is left, and that's what ends up happening. So I want to be really clear that the animal cruelty laws are not going to deal with the problems for these animals, including the orphaning of baby animals. Regularly, adult animals are taken out, babies are left to starve or die of heat prostration and other problems. Certainly, as the chair of a wildlife rehab center, I saw that regularly. Also, I concur with Liz White on the body gripping traps. I have seen several beavers show up with 3 legs, a leg that had been torn off by these traps, but the animal survives, and then there's no way to deal properly with that animal. Most times it can't be re-released because it couldn't survive in the wilds. So it goes through tremendous pain and suffering, and then often that also leaves orphan babies as well. We got a legal opinion, which is before you, by Simon Shields, which also concurs that it is well within the jurisdiction and would not be a conflict for the city to go ahead and regulate the wildlife removal companies. And finally, I just wanted to share with you a story that because we're a wildlife organization, we regularly get calls in the City of Toronto as well with complaints. I had a woman phone me not that long ago, just a few months ago, sobbing because she had already spent $1,500 having raccoons removed from her attic. The problem was not properly solved because it was a substandard operator. She had no more money to spend on the issue. Raccoon urine, she told me, was running down the walls of her toddler's room. She was very concerned for the well-being of her child, of course. And I explained to her, you know, there's wildlife removal companies, and then there's good wildlife removal companies. But of course, she had already spent so much money and had no more money. She told me that she intended to deal with the problem herself, which I told her could put her in danger and potentially her children as well. But that's what you're leaving for the residents of Toronto, is an unregulated system that leaves them with no ability to deal with these problems in the long run if they happen to hire the wrong company. And in her case, she said, well, I hired the least expensive company. But of course, because she had to hire them time and again to come back because they hadn't actually resolved the issue, it ended up costing her much more than had she hired someone who would have done the job properly. But there was no way for her to know that until she had already had the problem. So I would certainly want to recommend that you go ahead and vote in favor of regulating these companies, and that any regulations ensure that no body gripping traps are allowed in the City of Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Thanks so much for your presentation. Is there any other speakers on this item within the audience that would like to speak on it? If not, and the visiting members, not, questions to staff. Now, before we get to it, we have a confidential attachment from city staff that's subject to solicitor-client privileges, as well as we have a couple other legal opinions that may be subject to the same. So the question to the members of the committee is, do you have any questions for us to go into camera? No questions. Okay, so we'll continue with it. Questions to staff? No questions from staff. Okay, fantastic. Any speakers on the item? Councillor De Veramaker, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm going to move today a motion that I moved a year ago at Council, which was then referred to the provincial government for consideration. And unfortunately, as perhaps some of us expected, the province has done nothing, like on many other files we've dealt with at this committee. But I've been told by the clerks that I think the chair will have to defer this to the January meeting so that there is proper public notice given. I thought because we had given public notice of this meeting, it was in order, but the clerks have informed me that because we're amending one of the chapters of our bylaw, we have to give additional notice, so I accept their wisdom and their advice. Mr. Chair, I guess I'll speak more at the January meeting, but this is a motion that I've done in consultation with some of the speakers who came today, with industry representatives. And what I was heartened with is what I will call many of the legitimate, hardworking, ethical businesses in this industry want to be regulated. We have letters from companies like Orkin Canada, which is probably the largest I'll call it pest control and wildlife control in Canada, saying we want to be regulated because we actually do follow an ethical code and a moral code, and we don't rip people off, and we're not bandits, and we actually train our staff on how to take care of things properly. So I'm just going to move that motion for now, and I guess we'll have it come back in January. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other speakers? If not, I think that as chair, I think that's extremely important that, and that's required from us to provide public notice to all the stakeholders. Residents and the public overall, they have the right to inform and the right to speak on items that are important to all of us. So therefore, I'm going to move the following recommendation, and you have it on the screen. There we are. All those in favor? Against? Carry. Thank you. The next item is number 2, and we have speakers, but also we have a presentation from city staff. And this item is with regards to responsible dog ownership and results of public consultation. So we're going to have a presentation from city staff on this one.
Good morning, Chair, councillors, and members of the public. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you the results of our consultation into responsible dog ownership. In 2013, the Ombudsman initiated an investigation into Toronto Animal Services' response to a severe dog bite. Some of the results of that investigation and some of the recommendations to Toronto Animal Services was to review customer standards, customer service standards, and the Toronto Public Service Charter of Expectations. Also, response times to dog bites. At the time, our response was 5 days, and we improved it to 24 hours. The other request was to create a severity scale for dog bites and develop information that appears on both the website and educational pamphlets for members of the public so that they know what to do in the case of a dog bite. And other information that we've put on the website about responsible pet ownership and specifically responsible dog ownership. Down. It's not working. Okay. So in response, we changed our response time from 5 days to 24 hours. We made information available to the public and improvements to our processes and training of our staff, specifically in how to handle dog bites, how to handle the public, and how to make sure that there's no perceived conflict of interest issues. In addition to this report that was presented March 31st, 2015 to City Council, we wanted to comply with the direction to provide recommendations on how the city can effectively respond to incidents of dog bites and dogs at large that may pose a risk to public safety. We wanted to ensure that we reviewed how the city can effectively balance, manage, and address dog behavior, owner responsibility, and public safety, and to reduce the negative interactions between dog owners and non-dog owners, especially where they're sharing the same public spaces. And finally, engage the public through consultation. To ensure public safety, there are two pieces of legislation that Toronto Animal Services uses to ensure dogs are managed appropriately and the public is safe. Toronto Municipal Code Chapter 349, and we also use DOLA, Dog Owners Liability Act, which is a provincial piece of legislation. In 2014, Toronto Animal Services received 6,710 complaints related to animal bylaw issues. And a further review of this information specific to dog bites, 8% of those complaints received were related directly to dog-to-human bites, 3% were dog-to-animal bites, and 7% were dog attacks or menacing behavior. Interesting enough, the location where the dog-to-human bites occurred, the public seems to believe that a lot of these complaints were taking place in public parks. 54% of the dog bites that were reported actually occurred on private property, and of those, 35% occurred on the dog owner's property. 33% of those complaints were on public property, and 13% were unknown. The location where the dog-to-animal bites occurred, 34% on private property, of which 6% were on the dog owner's property, 62% on public property, of which 37% of that was on public property but not in a park, 13% were in a designated leash-free area, 12% were in a park where a leash was required, and 4% the location was unknown. We put a survey out on the web, and the survey ran from August 31st to October 30th. It was a comprehensive online survey specifically focused on dog behavior and dog owner responsibilities. We circulated the survey also through the councillors' offices, businesses, stakeholder groups, neighborhood dog and resident associations, as well as social media. So we tried to get the word out to the farthest reaching residents and businesses. We received through that survey over 2,500 responses. We also consulted with the public at 5 community meetings. And in addition to that, MLS staff consulted directly with College of Veterinarians of Ontario, the Ontario Veterinary Medicine Association, the University of Guelph Veterinary College Behavior Department, the North Toronto Veterinary Behavior Specialty Clinic, dog trainers, dog walkers, Toronto Humane Society, and we also consulted closely with our own staff, our own veterinarian staff. This is what we heard. 64% of the respondents believe that muzzling is sufficient to protect the public from dogs that have bitten. 60% of the respondents want to see the owner subjected to increased fines for dogs that have bitten. 40% of the respondents want special licensing, 44% want signage posted for dogs that have bitten, and 79% of the respondents want the city to invest in public awareness and information about dog owner safety and responsibilities. Some of the other things we heard: public safety concerns. Those who participated identified public safety concerns in public spaces, aggressive dogs in public spaces, dogs at large, including dogs off-leash in parks, not in designated off-leash areas, and dogs that are tethered in a public place while the owner is in a store, that sort of thing. Negative experience had lingering effects on some people and their dogs. Safety in the off-leash parks. A lot of people who participated identified public safety concerns in designated off-leash areas of the park, including children under 12 unaccompanied by an adult in a designated off-leash area, the dynamics of unaltered dogs that aren't spayed, dogs that are not neutered in designated off-leash areas, and the dynamics of large and small dogs in the same designated areas. Other thing, people told us that they wanted to attend consultation meetings, that attended the consultation meetings. They indicated that our bylaw was not clear. Most of them didn't know about the DOLA, the Dog Owner Liability Act, so that was a whole other conversation. But most people thought that the bylaw wasn't clear enough, it didn't speak in clear language. They all believe pretty much that the dog owner is responsible for their dog's behavior, and many reported that they did not know who to report a dog bite to or were unsure of what steps to take. Many reported that they would like to see the city take a bigger role in educating the public about dog safety and dog owner responsibilities. Enforcement. Some participants reported slow response times and not enough staff to investigate offenses where they occur, such as early morning or in the evening. Some were frustrated by their experience in reporting the incident, and others noted that offending behavior often continues after it's reported. Deterrence needed to prevent bad behavior should be considered. Toronto is the only city of 15 cities reviewed that does not have a definition of dangerous, vicious, or menacing dog in its bylaw. Toronto does not have additional licensing fees or ownership requirements for dogs deemed dangerous, vicious, or menacing. And the penalties included in Toronto's minimum and maximum fines that are established in Chapter 349 are somewhat lower than other cities. To help educate and inform the public, Chapter 349 needs to be clearer. The definitions need to be included to capture dangerous, vicious, and menacing dogs. Stakeholders and members of the public indicated that the City of Toronto should focus on education, enforcement, and increasing the fines. Next steps, MLS will report back to Licensing and Standards Committee in April 2016 with proposed bylaw amendments, which will include definitions of dangerous, vicious dogs. We'll add requirements for dog owners to identify themselves. will investigate provisions to increase authority to seize animals in distress or where there is a public safety concern. We are going to look at increasing and escalating penalties for offenses. We're going to review the bylaw for ambiguous language. We will develop an education and communication plan, and we'll develop an enforcement strategy. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Egliberry. Excellent presentation. Members of the committee, at this point, we can either ask questions or we can just go through the deputants and then ask questions at the end to staff. So we'll go through the deputations first. Great. Thank you. So we'll go to deputants now. First deputant on this item is Ana Maria Montfort, followed by Anna Bat.
I had submitted a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to wait a minute to see for it to come up.
Thank you. This is a presentation, the submission that they want to be shared with them. Thank you. You have minutes. Please go ahead.
Pardon me?
You have 5 minutes for your presentation. Please go ahead, and the clerk is going to.
I'm waiting for the slides to come up on the screen.
Okay, so take your time.
It's their time.
Can we assist the deputant, please? I'll put your time on hold.
Imogen, Della, Ting, those are the people I submitted the PowerPoint to yesterday. Is that right? And I can. Well, there's city staff. City staff who said that they was going to load it onto the thing. No, here, do you want me to email it to someone?
Yeah, in the meantime,
You want to go ahead and.
in the meantime, we'll continue with the other deputants to allow you
Absolutely.
the time that you need to sort it out. Anna Bat, the next deputant. And we'll come back to you, Ms. Montfort. Anna Bat, followed by Shauna Tom.
Hi, I'm Shauna.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, committee and chairman. My name is Shauna Tom. I'm a professional dog walker in Toronto, and I volunteer for spay-neuter clinics, behavior training, and I work in rescue. I started working with my brother's pit bulls informally in the late 90s, but my life went fully to the dogs in 2010. I quit the corporate life to dedicate my time and energy to the welfare of rescued and troubled dogs. When I took the survey, I found that I could not answer most of the questions adequately because they were ambiguous. This compelled me to attend the public forum meeting at the East York Civic Center. That discussion was productive, positive, and open. If I could choose only one point to be challenged in the current bylaws, it would be a matter of education. This would include, but not be limited to, the clear definitions of bite, fight, aggressive, dangerous, and vicious, and under control. These terms must be measurable and not open for interpretation. I believe that has also been stated before, but coming from a personal point of view, this is how dog walkers see it. I've requested that I be heard here today because they echo the conclusions in the summary that the ultimate goal is 0 dog bite incidents in the City of Toronto. To achieve this goal, preventative actions such as educating the public and clear and easy to understand bylaws are needed. A good portion of the general public, both dog owners and non-owners, don't have enough knowledge to understand how a dog communicates or why a dog does what it does. Although this is slowly changing, trying to educate someone in the middle of a confrontation is less than effective. It has taken me years to learn to work with difficult dogs in a controlled environment, and the learning never stops. A significant factor that makes the subject of these bylaws so volatile is the human emotional experience. Some dog with dog or dog with person situations evoke a very individual emotional response, not unlike that of a car accident. There is fear, anger, guilt, and panic blended into a toxic mix of adrenaline. Quite often, dogs experience this too, but not to the degree that the humans do. Most dogs can let go of this instantly when the humans are just getting started with blaming and name-calling. In turn, this upsets the dogs all over again. Dogs take their cues from the humans. Those that coddle their dogs or start yelling at the other human may find that in the near future that their dog may have social issues and wrongly blame it on the original incident. It's the human who can't let go and projects this onto their pet. My concerns are of the expectations the public will have with the DOLA and new bylaws. I have more questions than answers. How does one enforce cleaning up after the dogs? I've offered bags to both owners and walkers, and the responses vary from "thank you very much" to "I'm on a long distance call" with a dismissive wave. How does one set a standard for training when the extremes are so far apart? Quite often, the difference in training philosophies themselves are a point of contention. There's a lot of trainer-based bashing going on, especially when it comes to difficult dogs. Dogs under a guardian's control. Are the common definition and the prevalent reality even close? I challenge this by going to any dog gathering area and ask people to call their dogs while engaged with another dog or sniffing. Very few, if any, dogs will come on the first command. Those who accuse others of not having their dogs under control usually don't have control of their dogs either. Basic communication is a combination of body language, posture, positions of ears, tail movement, mouth, and tongue actions. Their verbal capacity is limited to barking and growling. If barking and growling is seen as a negative or a prohibited behavior, then we are taking away one of the dog's few meanings to communicate. As with humans and other dogs, the second and least acknowledged part of effective communication is who's listening. Specific to dog bites, there are at least 3 sides to every story: the targets, the alleged offenders, and somewhere in between lies the facts. How is that determined? How does one provide proof? If there are several dogs involved in a scuffle, how do you know which one did the biting? How do you know that multiple didn't do the biting? In the context of the whole incident considered, most incidents start long before the contact and the noise begin. You can't just isolate the actual scuffle itself. The DOLA indicates that a dog that has bitten is 100% responsible. What if that dog bit in defense? I don't believe an absolute statement should be applied, although determining the offender and victim can be very difficult. If I were to look at dog ownership in the same light as raising children, the result is based on how successful the adults are. As you need a license to own a gun or drive a car, you do not to raise children or dogs. Regardless of this contrast, the accountability that responsible dog owners are held to starts with the guardian meeting the basic needs of shelter and food. But in a city where space is shared, that extends to structured training for safety, physical release.
Please try to wrap up.
Okay, exercise, and meeting the mental and emotional needs of a thinking and feeling being. Why am I passionate? Why do people want world peace? It is important to me that our pets are able to happily coexist with other dogs and people. The evolution of wolves to domesticated dogs is probably the most developed interspecies relationship. It is unrealistic to expect every person to love dogs, but there has to be mutual respect amongst dog owners and with non-dog owners.
Thank you. Any questions to the deputant? If not, thank you for your presentation. Ms. Mumford, are you ready? Yes. Okay, so we'll go back to you.
I got better than a laptop. I made you a deck.
Are we ready now?
Yeah, I'm ready, thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. My name is Anna Maria Mountfort, and I'm here to support the city's efforts to promote responsible pet ownership. My perspective is that of the dog bite victim, and if I could be so bold, I'm here to advocate for fellow victims. We have the unfortunate distinction of being the family that was mentioned in Fiona Crean's report. My daughters and I were visiting friends in the West End of Toronto. We were there for several hours, and they were dog sitting a dog that belonged to a neighbor who lived down the street. Veterinarians, one of whom is a staff member at Toronto Animal Services. After several hours of everything going right and everything being completely fine, my daughters were in the backyard playing with the adult neighbor, who coincidentally is a trained veterinary technician. I went in to check on dinner while my daughters were playing in the yard, making perfumes out of dried flowers and such. And for no reason and under no provocation, the dog got on its hind legs, grabbed Audrey by the face, and tried to shake her to death. It's not easy to get over. It's a very serious injury. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about what it's like, because I don't know that you've heard recently what it's like to be a dog bite victim. 911 is called. The police show up, EMS come, and you are taken to the hospital where you're attended to. We went to Sick Kids. Public health is called right away. It is the doctor's responsibility to call public health when the skin is broken. The public health officers launch an investigation, and they do a quarantine. They issue a quarantine order. A dog is supposed to be quarantined for 10 days and isolated, and they're very specific. Then public health gives the file to Toronto Animal Services, and Toronto Animal Services' purview is the Dog Owner Liability Act and the bylaws, as you saw. And then under the Dog Owner Liability Act, a victim of dog bite is allowed to pursue civil litigation for any damages incurred from the dog bite, and usually a house insurance company will pay for that if you have house insurance. Otherwise, it's the owner of the dog that's 100% on the hook. Suing insurance companies is no fun. And it's also extremely expensive to the victim, not to the offender. So basically, the question that I have, I'm at a why do I care slide. I had, as you know, legendarily bad service from Toronto Animal Services. The animal control officer was rude, unprofessional, and dangerous, frankly. And at one point I asked him, are you trying to tell me that this is what you do when a dog bites another person? You won't issue a muzzle order. You won't investigate whether the quarantine was broken, even though there was evidence of it. You don't charge anyone. You don't do anything. And he said, yeah, absolutely. That's how we deal with it. He said, let me tell you about another little girl. And he proceeded to completely violate the privacy of somebody else and told me about another case of a little girl who was mauled by a dog. And he said, we didn't even issue a muzzle order because she startled the dog. At which point I nearly had a stroke, because not only did he violate the privacy of another citizen, but he essentially confirmed that's just how we do it here at Toronto Animal Services. And that has been my motivation, to know that other people have been through what I have been through, and Toronto Animal Services knowingly did nothing. There are a variety of other reasons, but I'm going to run out of time, so let's move on. Given that you go to the hospital if there's a serious bite or the skin has been broken and it's reported to public health and then the file is transferred to Toronto Animal Services, you would assume that Toronto Animal Services and Toronto Public Health have approximately the same reporting numbers per year for dog bites. So I did a Freedom of Information request, and I got these numbers this August. And what I found, or what your numbers showed me, was that the difference between what public health reports and what Toronto Animal Services reports is shocking. There's a slide number 6. I made it all nice and tidy for you in a table, going back to the year 2006, because the Dog Owner Liability Act came into force in 2005. Toronto Animal Services has never come close to responding to the number of dog bites, yes, the number of dog bites that public health has. In fact, after everyone assured me that they were working so hard to improve outcomes in the year 2014, the difference is 822 dog bites on people. I'm going to have to leave it at that because I've run out of time, but basically, I welcome your questions.
Thank you. And members of the committee, we do have a presentation that was circulated to all the members of the committee.
Mr. Chair, I would, I guess procedurally ask that we allow the deputant to finish her PowerPoint today. I know she's at 5 minutes, but I think given the circumstances of what's happened to her family, it's reasonable.
Yeah, it's up to the committee members to, yeah. Under the procedure by law is all deputants and members of council, we are giving 5 minutes at this point. So to make this change for one deputant, we'll have to do it for all. So it's, that would be the...
No, I'm just...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Perhaps Councillor de Bearmaker may ask her a question that she could answer by continuing her PowerPoint.
That's a nice way of putting it.
I didn't think we were allowed to do that, but if that helps,
I think you might be allowed to.
okay, I guess the chair won't challenge me.
Fantastic. Okay. There we go. Thank you for your presentation. Councillor de Bearmaker, you're the first one. Do you have any questions?
My first question is, could you finish your let us know what's in the rest of your PowerPoint presentation?
It'd be my pleasure, thank you. So yes, after all assurances that everyone was taking this extremely seriously, particularly given what we've been through, if you look at the slide number 6, you'll see that actually the number holds steady, basically. Toronto Animal Services has not even ever come close to responding to the number of dog bites on people that are transferred to them from public health, which is your agency. I did the math and I added up the difference going back to 2006, and the number is 4,814 dog bites on people. So, it's important to change the bylaw. I think it is. And then the question comes, well, you can change the bylaw, but do you have the resources in place to enforce the bylaw? Right? I think that that's a question that you'll see with a lot of things. It's like, change the law as much as you want, but are you going to do anything with it? So what I've noticed from studying this, because I just kept asking questions, and I was talking to neighbors and talking to veterinarians and talking to dog trainers and talking to dog walkers and people in the parks, and they just all had stories for me. I know this person got bit by a dog and nobody did anything, or be careful for that guy. He has a dog that's crazy and has already attacked, and all these different things. So I just thought, this is really strange. Because people were relying on you. The citizens are relying on on Toronto Animal Services to be a public safety agency. So it seems to me, looking at what's been going on at Toronto Animal Services for the last few years, that if we go to slide number 8, basically, that Toronto Animal Services has become more of an animal rescue agency than it has a public safety and enforcement agency. I know on slide number 8 that you've seen your budgets cut and that you've had your resources cut, and that when you have budget cuts, you need to make very careful choices with these resources. And it seems that through your chosen activities, you've demonstrated a preference for doing animal rescue work over public safety and enforcement. And I mean, the numbers that I presented consistently show that there hasn't been an appropriate response to dog bites on people. And what I found dealing with Toronto Animal Services was there was really a blame the victim approach to dog bites. Prove to us that you did everything right, when it should be the other way around. It's responsible pet ownership. The next slide. In the last few years, I know some of the good work that you've done, but these are you have made these choices instead of doing enforcement and public safety. You've done stuff with respect to cat rescue work. You've built new cat shelters. You've rescued dogs from other jurisdictions, such as New Orleans and Montreal. You bought a bus, apparently, a mobile cat and spay or pet and spay neuter clinic that goes to the priority neighborhoods and spays cats. You collect donations from corporations, you collect donations from citizens, and from what I understand, you've also managed, Toronto Animal Services also managed to get Section 37 money from some of the MLS committee members. Is that appropriate? And if you're doing that, the leadership is choosing to do that. That's your judgment. That's your risk analysis. Those are all the leadership qualities. You've chosen to do those things instead of taking care of dog bite victims, instead of, dealing with dogs at large. You're directing your resources and your energy, instead of protecting the public, to doing these kinds of activities that frankly belong to the Toronto Humane Society. Next slide. Legal process and risk to the city, and this is where I'm speaking directly to Municipal Licensing and Standards Committee. I am here to ask you to take this as seriously as you've taken Uber or food trucks. One of the big players is the insurance industry. In those issues, let's be honest. Let's all try not to get sued, which is, I think, it's got to be a priority. Toronto Animal Services is responsible for the Dog Owner Liability Act. The Attorney General for Ontario thinks that you are enforcing the Dog Owner Liability Act. If you are not doing it, then who is? I wrote a letter to the AG, and the response that I got, part of it is there. The rest of it is just their standard messaging about the DOLA. But as you see, while the legislation provides municipal officials with significant legal powers in relation to dangerous dogs, local officials make specific decisions regarding enforcement. So that's you. And this one is the really big one, and this is the risk analysis that was not present in the previous presentation, but that comes from experience. Insurance companies do not insure the second dog bite. They don't. They rely on the city to keep clear records of what dogs have bitten previously. And given that Toronto Animal Services has not been keeping good records, the insurance...
Thank you, ma'am. Your time is over for the
Yeah, this is the
questioning
one
time.
about
Is
how
5
the city
minutes,
could
unless
really
if
get
any other
sued.
member wants to ask another question.
Sure.
Thank you for coming today. I realize the trauma that you faced, and I was wondering if you have anything else to add.
Yes, I do. The insurance industry does not insure the second dog bite. And this is really, really important because we see a lot of repeat offenders. The insurance industry have been talking about how they've never seen more dog bites in Ontario. You can call them. I've spoken to the Ontario Trial Lawyers Association, and they said that they're finding more and more lawyers are choosing to specialize in dog bites. That's got to tell you something. You should also examine the city's responsibilities under the Occupier Liability Act. All those off-leash parks are hosted by the City of Toronto. If people are calling you to tell you that there are dangerous and vicious dogs running around in the off-leash park and you don't do anything about it and someone gets hurt, you could get sued for negligence. There is no question of that. So this is real stuff. This is real money, and the insurance industry have weapons. So please consider it. I would hate to see you guys get sued. Next question, or next slide, work to do. I think that there has to be a complete revision of the animal-related bylaws. The model in Calgary is the one that everybody talks about. It seems to be the best. It is the golden standard. Update your policy and procedures to reflect that mandate, because the fact of the matter is you get your mandate from the law. You don't get it from, the kinds of that's exactly what you do as a public service. I request that the city manager writes to the Attorney General for Ontario to get clear directives and explanations on the city's role with respect to the Dog Owner Liability Act. Work to replace the divisive language we currently use based on shared values, which are nonviolence, community, peaceful shared spaces, and how to take care of injured parties when accidents happen, because they will. And I also request that you do a human resources review at Toronto Animal Services, because I believe that since you've hired so many people from the Toronto Humane Society, that they are conflicted in doing their work as an enforcement agency at Toronto Animal Services. The Toronto Humane Society has position papers about how they don't agree with the Dog Owner Liability Act, and half your staff comes from the Humane Society. Last slide. Dog owners in Toronto, for the most part, are caring and community-minded people. At their best, they do things like reunite lost pets on Facebook, and they, you know, do fundraisers for dogs with cancer and good things like that. At their worst, dog owners are rude, particularly when they know that they are breaking the law. They choose sides based on emotion, not fact. However, for the most part, as most things are in life, it's the few who ruin it for the many. That having been said, there's a list here of things that you could do. I don't see a difference in many respects between what Toronto Animal Services and the Humane Society do. So maybe there's a partnership there where, you know, could the Humane Society take over the 4 Toronto Animal Services shelter, and, you know, we build a community center on River Street for people. Something, I don't know, some out-of-the-box thinking. But, you know, I think that a review of how things are done from top to bottom at Toronto Animal Services is warranted, or else, frankly, you guys are going to get sued by the insurance industry. There you go.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you for your presentation. Do we have Anna Bad? If not, we'll go to the next one. Miroslav Glavik. Miroslav, still here. And the last deputant that we have, Irene Boreki.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Please go ahead.
I had a speech prepared, but I want to support some of the things that Anna Maria said, and to remind you of some of the history of animal services. Prior to amalgamation, the sheltering function was exclusively done by Toronto Humane Society. After amalgamation, councillors voted to bring it in-house, which thus increased the size of government. And it seemed like it was a battle between the CUPE and the Teamsters, because those are the 2 unions that were involved. I believe, as she does, that we would be better served with sheltering being outside of Toronto Animal Services for 2 reasons. Number 1, it is a conflict of interest for animal bylaw officers, a quasi-policing organization, to be soliciting donations and investigating their competition. A friend of mine runs a 1-woman rescue. The pet store that she works out of was visited by Toronto Animal Services officer. They compete for that space for adoption. Fortunately, that owner was not stupid. He knew what was going on and told them to go away, preserving my friend's right to do adoptions at that facility. That is not right. That should never have been allowed to happen, and that is a byproduct of allowing sheltering and enforcement to exist in the same department. The second point I'd like to make is, once you brought licensing in under the Miller government, it is simply a tax grab. And you diverted more staff towards those licensing exercises. You hired people to look into people's windows and accuse them of having cats in order to get licenses paid for. The problem with the licensing is 2 things. 1, it doesn't serve any purpose other than to get you money. And if you're going to do that, you should do that with cyclists. They should be paying for infrastructure if animal lovers have to pay for the killing of animals in the shelters. Then 2 years ago, when Ms. Montford was here priorly, giving her story, and in 2 years nothing has happened to help her case along, no one has been held accountable at Toronto Animal Services, you then agreed to allow a Pet Perks program be created in order to entice people to buy those licenses. Your current staff report clearly states that that has not worked. You are still at 30% dog compliance, 10% cat compliance. But you again have moved staff over into these perks programs rather than dealing with any of the enforcement issues. So I agree with Ms. Montfort. Your complete priorities are out of focus to what your job is supposed to be. The only way for us to keep you accountable is to come here. And some of the things in that report really irked me because there's so many false statements. But what I want to do is pick just one, because I realize there isn't very much time. I am really tired of hearing about the comparison to Calgary Animal Services. First of all, there is a long dissertation written by Nathan Winograd, the expert on the no-kill movement, on his website, comparing Calgary Animal Services with the progressive director to the regressive policies of Toronto Animal Services. Feel free to read that on his website. I believe I don't have the time to go into it. However, what I do like to say is that Mr. Bruce has basically put in the no-kill equation at his shelter. And the other problem is that everybody keeps saying the city of Calgary is no-kill. That is false. The City of Calgary Animal Services is no kill. The Calgary Humane Society performs the killing. So the City of Calgary Animal Services has the compassion of the animal lovers in the city on their side. In Toronto, it's the other way around. Toronto Humane Society is known for no-kill policies, while Toronto Animal Services continue to kill more animals than actually go out alive. Why are you asking people who love animals to give money to you for the purpose of killing them? If we love our animals, we would rather give them to people who love them and will rescue them. There have been many occasions where I was here 2 years ago, I'm going to backtrack, where you passed a motion to allow anybody with a household income under $50,000 to receive a free spay-neuter program. It is next to impossible to get that free spay-neuter program. But go to Calgary's website and you will see a single point of entry for everybody with a low household income that will get them into one of 5 services for free, including that free spay-neuter. I went to Jack Lakey a year ago with the story that you're not allowing people to get this free service. He put it in the Star in his column, The Fixer. To this day, no one has done anything to correct it. In fact, he said staff were lying to him. They tried to pass TNR stats out as owned animal spay-neuters. They tried to tell him that it's a policy and not a program. And then you have the gall to say you want to compare it to Calgary and you want to do what Calgary does in terms of licensing. Calgary is open and accountable to what they say they're going to do. Toronto Animal Services not. I went out and rescued a cat who was sitting up on the roof of a bank in minus 23-degree temperature, calling Animal Services to rescue that cat, and all they needed was a 10-foot ladder. We are not allowed to climb a ladder to save a cat. A total stranger off the street saved that cat for me. Jack Lakey wrote about it. A few councillors responded to me when I emailed them, but Animal Services has done nothing.
Thank
As
you,
an
ma'am.
animal lover, why do I give you my money?
Thank you. Any questions? Councilor Karchanis.
Ma'am, I want to thank you for coming. I understand the passion behind your deputation. Now, I was wondering if there's anything else more that you might want to add to enlighten us and to...
Councillor Karygiannis, sure. I have cats, and I would like to understand why the City of Toronto thinks that my cats are just as dangerous as a gun. Those are the only 2 items in my household requiring a license. Not only that, but I'm not getting 1 license for me as a cat owner. I'm getting 1 license for every cat that I have in my home. That's not a license, that's a registration tax.
How many cats do you have, ma'am?
I have 4. And I also do rescue. I have 50 feral cats I feed on a daily basis, which Toronto Animal Services will spay-neuter, but they do not protect those cats from people who want them removed, who want them dead, who want them killed. That was another article that Jack Lakey wrote in the Star, which has not been addressed.
How does that affect your neighbors on...
They're indoor cats, sir.
So these are not outdoor cats?
They're not outdoor cats. They're microchipped. I do not need them to be registered with Toronto Animal Services. A found animal is better off going to a vet clinic to have a microchip checked than to have a license read. My friend of mine found a dog wandering at Yonge and St. Clair a little while back, midnight. We know Animal Services is going to come for hours, and we don't know what they're going to do to that poor dog. We drove him to a 24-hour pet clinic so he could be reunited with his family in the morning.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to speak to this item? Okay, questions to staff?
Excuse me, I would like to speak. Could I speak? I'm not registered to speak.
Okay, please come forward. Yes, please. Yeah, he's not. I call him. Yeah, if you don't mind just to state your name, please.
Yes, my name is Lois Sklar. I'm speaking now because I feel very strongly about all the calls that I've made to the city, to the 311 number for the past probably 10 years about dogs off leash, and I really wasn't aware of all the bites in the city, and that's really alarming as well. I don't dislike dogs, but I do feel a safety factor when I'm walking in a park and a dog comes running up to me and it's not on a leash. That is very bothersome to me. I don't understand why my calls and my emails and I've been directed to many different agencies have not been respected over the years. I don't understand why the bylaw enforcement is not enforced. I don't understand why when I take pictures of dogs off leash and send it in, nothing happens. So I really feel strongly that there needs to be, and it sounds like there are lots of issues with the Toronto Animal Services that I wasn't aware of, and I think that there needs to be more done, and I'm hoping that with this new look into the bylaw and that something good will come of it so that we don't feel, I feel threatened a lot of times. I've actually asked dog owners to either pick up the stuff that the dog has left, and they've become very violent and rude to me. One person actually pushed me several years ago and told me it was none of my business. So I think the education component is a really important part, but the enforcement is also really important. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Any questions? Great. Any questions to staff now? Members of the committee? If not, speakers? You have questions? Councillor De Beremaker, please go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I guess my first question to staff is, in terms of the auditor's report, would you say the auditor's report gave Animal Services an A+ as a grade? Were they critical of Animal Services? And so what did the auditor say about us, if you will, or Toronto Animal Services, and have we responded and implemented all the recommendations?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the auditor report that was done in 2009-2010 had a number of recommendations to improve licensing, to improve operations, enforcement, as well as policy and procedures and regulatory issues. I would say that the report pointed out some very important shortfalls of Animal Services, and over the last 4 years, we have implemented almost every one of those recommendations, with the exception of the pet licensing compliance rates. We continue to struggle with those.
Through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of enforcement staff, people have mentioned about not dog bites as well as dogs off leash. Can you tell me roughly how many enforcement staff we had 5 or 10 years ago, how many we have today, how many you think we might have in the future?
In 2011, we had 22 enforcement staff. Prior to that, there were about 18 summer students that were cut from the budget, as well as a number of ACCO positions, and I'm going to ballpark it at 10. So resources have been reduced due to budgetary constraints.
Do you think you have enough enforcement staff to do a good job of protecting people?
Currently, we're not, through you, Mr. Chair, we're struggling to meet our basic response times, and I don't believe we have adequate resources to meet the needs and the expectations of the public.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I do have a couple of questions. Listening from the deputants, it seems that there is a need for clarity of the bylaw. Is that correct?
Clarity?
There is a need for clarity of the bylaw.
Yes, there is.
What are the penalties for owners who are not complying with existing bylaws?
So penalties include muzzle orders for dogs that have bitten. We do charges, fines for noncompliance with the bylaw through both Chapter 349 and DOLA. Sometimes we, if the dog is a safety issue, we will obtain a warrant to remove that animal from that owner. That follows a very long court case, some of them up to 2 years, where these animals are now being kept in our shelters until that court date can resolve the issue. So dangerous dogs that have the potential to bite and are definitely public safety issues continue to be a challenge for us, but we are making headways with getting warrants to remove these animals from homes to keep the public safe.
Great. I understand that you've been doing quite a bit of community consultations, and one of the amendments to the bylaw would be in terms of public education and enforcement as well. And that's kind of information that's coming forward, in April of 2016. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have developed, actually, Mrs. Mountford helped us develop a brochure, a public brochure. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We used to have a public education program where we would go into schools with one of our animals dedicated to the program as well. That program was canceled in 2012, again, due to budgetary restraints. So we're no longer going into public schools teaching young children how to react around dogs. And that was a very popular program. Yeah.
Please, ma'am, be respectful. Please go ahead.
What was the other part of your question?
No, the question was in terms of the reports coming forward in April 2016 as it relates to the educational component and the enforcement.
Yes, so we will develop an enforcement plan as well as an education and a communication plan regarding educating the public, ways to educate the public. Can we educate the public through different venues like our chip truck, like other outreach initiatives? So, and also we're looking at how we can educate the public using volunteers to get the word out in the communities. That is something that our staff don't have the time nor the mandate to do.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? If not, speakers? Otherwise, I'd like to move the Yeah. Councilor DeBarmaker, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I will move the staff recommendation for receipt, and I do look forward to the staff bringing forward their amendments, I guess, next year to help strengthen our bylaws and to make sure that the public are safe. Mr. Chair, it is a serious issue. All of us, I'm sure, have walked down the street or walked into a local park and had, and I don't blame the dog necessarily, but had a dog owner who's been irresponsible, who has let their little Schnauzer or their big Doberman sprint across the football field, down across the ravine, up into the highlands, totally unsupervised. And if you're comfortable with dogs like I am, you can still be frightened. Because when I see that big Doberman bounding towards me, I don't know if that's a friendly Doberman or a vicious Doberman. When I see that short little Schnauzer bounding towards me, I don't know if it's coming to wag its tail or if it's going to come and try to bite me. And I'm a person who's comfortable with dogs. If you're frightened of dogs, like some of my own family members, it's a terrifying experience. You see a Doberman sprinting towards you, you are terrified. The fright and flight response kicks in for some people, which if you know dogs, you know you really shouldn't be running. But I've seen children run, screaming and crying and jumping up on rocks and on park benches as dogs encircle them. And I'll say in their eyes, certainly attack them. So we have to make sure we have enough enforcement staff. I don't think we do. I think that's, I've been on council for 12 years. The city has failed to provide enough enforcement staff to make sure that the public is safe and we can follow up on these episodes. It is a failure on our part. And it is difficult for all of us as committee members to go into council, which we're going to go in this spring, and say, let's raise taxes more so we can get more enforcement officers to protect our children and to protect ourselves. It is a very difficult thing for us to do, but I think it's one thing that we're going to have to try and insist upon when we go to council is to make sure we're properly staffed, to make sure we provide good services. In terms of some of the comments about, well, people giving money for dog parks and animal services and not so much for children, I would say that that information is probably incorrect. As a councillor, I've probably given over $1 million of Section 37 money to local dog parks and animal hospitals, but I've given probably $4 million to children's splash pads and children's playgrounds. And giving an example of Thompson Park, close to my house, very well-known park in Scarborough, I helped build as a local councillor in cooperation with the local community, the largest dog park in the city of Toronto. And just because we spent money on a dog park at Thompson Park doesn't mean we don't love children. In fact, what it means is we love both children and dogs, because the dogs go to this magnificent dog park, and what it means for the kids over at the splash pad is there are fewer dogs running around Thompson Park off leash. One of the reasons we created the off-leash dog park is because dog owners who love their dogs would take them out to the middle of a baseball diamond, let them run all over the place, frighten other members of the public. I have a very diverse community. Some people from different countries would literally leave the park when they saw dogs running loose because they're afraid of them. So those inconsiderate dog owners were impacting other people. We couldn't have a full-time staff person there every single day of the year to stop these people from doing it. Their dogs would poo in the middle of the baseball field so that when the other kids came to play baseball and are going to catch pop flies, they're running through piles of poo. Once we created the dog park, we had a very easy enforcement strategy. All you dog owners, and there were dozens and dozens of them, because Thompson Park's a very large park, all of you are no longer allowed to let your dogs off leash. In the general area, you have to go to the dog park. And I would say we have reduced conflicts in that park probably by 90%, maybe 95%. So when people see us spending money on dogs, it's not because we don't love children, it's because you have to love both. Certainly the spay and neuter clinic is not just for cats, it's for cats and dogs. And one of the reasons, and again, my personal experience in life, some of the most aggressive dogs are the ones that haven't been spayed or neutered, especially neutered. So when I go to the dog park and I see the unneutered males, I know who's going to cause trouble, unfortunately. So by having a spay and neuter clinic go all across the city and encourage more people to spay and neuter their Doberman or their German Shepherd or their Schnauzer, it means your children are going to be safer because of the services that the city provides. So I would encourage the members of the public, when you see this spay and neuter clinic, don't think it's some nefarious plot against your children. Remember, it's a plot to help protect your children and to provide good, humane care for the animals that we have as well. So, Mr. Chair, I will be watching this new report very closely when it comes forward, and I hope we can all work together to make sure we somehow get more enforcement staff to protect our children. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so we have a recommendation is to receive the report for information. All those in favor? Against? Carry. Thank you. We'll move to the next item, item number 3, and that's the committee work plan for 2016-2018, and the item was held because there are a couple of questions, I believe. Councilor Madlo, and it was, I believe, Councilor DeGiorgio who had questions on this. Any questions to staff? Comments? Yes. Okay, so we don't have any questions. We'll go to comments.
I had a question for staff.
Councilor DeGiorgio.
Yeah, I was looking at the projected date for the committee receiving I guess a report on the review of the property standards bylaw. Now, I know that I was anticipating that we were going to get something this year, but now I understand we're not getting anything until next year. And I'm just wondering, is there anything to prevent our bringing forward just potential amendments to the property standards bylaw and to have them implemented prior to the report coming back? I've got some.
Through the chair to Councilor DeGiorgio, we would want to bring forward all recommendations and amendments to the property standards bylaw at one time, as opposed to individual changes.
I understand that, but I had proposed a change going back a year ago, and I was told, well, let's wait for this proposed property standards bylaw review to come forward at the end of the year. Now I'm looking at another year, and the kind of changes I'm looking for are very, very harmless, really, at the end of the day. It's just a matter of tightening up the language of the property standards bylaw to close some loopholes. I'm just wondering if we could at least look at it.
We will take a look at it, Councilor, and I'll talk to you further about it if you would like.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, we'll go to comments. And we have Councilor Madlo. Please go ahead.
I simply want to encourage this chair, our mayor, this committee, and council to do a complete rethink as to how we approach municipal licensing and standards matters. We are asking far too much of our staff and we give them far too little to do it with. They are spending so much time writing reports on things that we're asking them to report on rather than putting their resources into doing the things we're asking them to do. And then as soon as we've asked them to write another 1,000 reports, we ask them to do another thing and then report on it again. They can't keep writing reports and do everything we've asked them to do and then take on another 10 things every single month that we ask them to do. So when we get residents complaining at 6 in the morning that a developer isn't, or their contractor isn't respecting the noise bylaw, and we can't get anyone out there for a few days, and by the time they get there, the whole issue's over and they can't actually see anyone doing anything in the act because, well, frankly, it's already done and there's no charges to be laid, we have no one to blame but ourselves. We have turned this entire system into a dysfunctional process, and that's not to point the finger at our staff. They're hardworking, they're competent, and they're doing everything we've asked them to do to the best of their ability. But there's no way that they're going to catch up on the list that we've asked them to do unless we do a complete rethink as to how we approach them, how we work with them, and the demands that we make of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councilor Di Veronique.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to be moving any motions. I just want to be put on record that I will be consulting with our Deputy City Manager and our senior staff to make sure that we do review some of the wildlife, where did it go? Options for mitigating human-wildlife conflict in the city, because it doesn't have a date. So I don't want to, by accepting this report and not moving a motion, be told in a month or 3 months from now, sorry, Councillor, you had your chance back in the fall, back in November, you didn't say anything, so too bad for you. I think I know why this report is here, and it's here for a very good reason. I just want to make sure that Mr. Chair, with your support, that we have flexibility to bring items forward. I have a slightly different, I guess, lens than Councillor Matlow. I agree with much of what he said, but not all of it. We're living in a very big city that's getting bigger. And that's why we have more conflicts with noise in the morning, with more dogs in the park, because not only are there more dogs, but there are more families and children in parks that used to be perhaps big enough to accommodate everybody. Now you've got new condos all around them, and you've got 50 more dogs and you've got 80 more children, and that does put a strain on our resources. I think, though, I look at this list, and I can't find a single report here that I would say, well, this is an unnecessary report. It's a inconsequential report. In fact, we could delete it. I mean, the first list on this list of reports, responsible dog ownership. We just had a family that came and presented to us saying how devastated their family has been through a horrible, horrible incident that happened to their family. I think we have certainly a moral obligation and a legislative and legal obligation to protect that family and other families. And whether it's fireworks, noise, littering, methadone clinics, derelict properties, the MRAP program, cafes, indoor temperatures in apartment buildings, street food vending, ground transportation, and Uber and limos and taxis have 38 reports. So while I agree there's maybe too many reports for our staff to do, I think we have to be reflective as a council and say, if we can, I would welcome Councillor Matlow or any member of council to say, let's eliminate these 14 reports because they're really not important. If that's what we believe, let's do that. But if we believe they're all important, then we are failing because we're not giving our staff sufficient resources to catch up with these reports. So not only do we need enforcement staff, but we need staff to follow through in these projects. And the challenge for us is at budget time, we all feel the pressure because this is one department of 17 who all come forward and say there's a $1 billion backlog in the water department, there's a $1 billion backlog in the TTC, there's almost $1 billion backlog in Toronto community housing. If we want to fix the mouth of the Don River, it's another $1 billion. If you want to fix the Gardiner Expressway, I'm going to call it over 30 years, another $1 billion. And that's just the big projects. Never mind the day-to-day operations of our daycare centers, our community centers, and our libraries. So we will all have to do some soul searching, and perhaps it'll be one of us on this committee that moves a motion to either increase taxes or find a way to provide more staff. I personally believe that the senior staff that are here today do need more resources. Again, the taxi file alone, you say it's one report. Well, it's one report that took 1.5 years to create with, I think it was 2,500 people at one meeting, with an industry that's $1 billion a year industry. So when we put down here, this is just one report. It's one report that will take at least 1 year of one person's, staff person's life, if not a whole team of them. So I'm aware of this conflict that we're under. I think it's the nature of government to balance people's desires and needs with the financial reality of what we can take from our taxpayers. But I'm one of those people who think that we need to make a strong case to the public to say, here's why we're taking your taxes, here's what we're doing with it, and hopefully you're going to think it's good value for money. So, Mr. Chair, I look forward to seeing all of these reports come forward. I just know that staff do need some more help. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Janice.
Thank you, Chair. I listened very carefully to Councillor Mather, and I'm going through the projects: responsible dog ownership, fireworks, noise, licensing, visibility of licensing methadone clinics, vacant, derelict, and abandoned properties, indoor temperature standards, and I can go on and on and on. I'd be hard-pressed to see that we should drop one of these items. I realize that staff have different responsibilities and different priorities, and maybe we should actually go to the Budget Committee and say that this department, because of the complexities that it has and the responsibilities, might need more staff. You can't kill any of these reports. And these reports are something which is very important, and I know it's time-consuming and time-sensitive, but not to do the work that we've been given, and not to be responsible and say, let's not bring anything else new. That's like saying, well, the clock stops in the City of Toronto, and therefore, until this is done, we can't. We cannot engage in something new, and if somebody comes to us and says, look, I think this is important, we'll say, well, the stuff that's there right now is more important than what you're bringing forward, and we're not going to look at it until, 2019, 2020. Therefore, I believe that, although I agree that we got to be responsible, but I think there's got to be more staffing provided to this department in order to do the work that it needs. And if it means cutting back in other pet projects that we have going on, as like removing the signs in our windows, a motion that was passed by a councillor that says we should remove any signs that we have in our windows, and we spent, I don't know how many thousands of dollars writing letters to the councillors and everything else about a particular sign. I think that our time should be more focused and more wisely used versus using something petty as, having staff going around to each office and asking us to remove the sign. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that was a motion brought by one of the councillors here. But anyways, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Councillor DiGiorgio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I certainly share the frustration of Councillor Matlow. The municipal licensing department just doesn't have enough clout, I would say, not so much resources. I think they really have very little power simply because the provincial regulations don't give them very much power. For example, if someone is clearly violating a bylaw, but a municipal officer isn't on the spot at the time the person is violating the bylaw, we can't do anything about it. So, yeah, we need many more resources to be on the spot when bylaws are being violated, but that becomes totally undoable. I mean, even the police, if you examine the police budgets and whatnot, we could argue that if to catch people speeding, you got to have more people or more police on the streets. So there is this dilemma, certainly of financial resources. But I personally believe that for bylaw enforcement to be more effective, we have to rely on the evidence gathered by people in communities, and we have to take their evidence and be able to take that to court. we don't do enough of that, and the penalties, when we finally do get to court, aren't large enough to dissuade some of the, the 6 o'clock developers that are making noises. We should be able to get to those people by having the residents that live in the area have documentation that establish that the noise levels were high, and take that to court and ding these guys when we get them to court. That's the only way. I don't think having more bylaw officers at 6 o'clock a.m. or 12 p.m. is going to do the trick. We just aren't able to do that. And even having people working on weekends. I'd love to have them in my area as a pilot project, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will speak to this item. And actually, that's, if we really think about it, we are dealing with this committee with almost everything under the sun. And I do concur with Councilor Malo, like, is this happening too often that members of council, they're asking for new reports and with time limits on top of it. So, and that's not fair to city staff to begin with, and that's not fair to members of council who have asked for reports via notice of motion at city council or through this committee, and they've been waiting for those reports for 5 years. So how fair is it that when we have, since 2010, more than 130 directives from city council, and also through this committee, and other standing committees council, is outstanding reports since 2010. That's totally unacceptable. So as chair of the committee, at the beginning of the term, I did ask for a work plan. And for that work plan to be combined is with, we had about 112 directives, and that's going to be combined into 28 projects, which makes so much sense. So all these projects that are going to be bundled together in reports either, for example, with the taxi industry, we had a number of directives from council. Hopefully we're going to end up with one single report, and that will be the end of it. And so on with the other items as well. So, and those are the items that we have them today in attachment 1. So to me, that's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of vision that we need. And as chair of the committee, I've been working with city staff to bring this to the committee, as I promised to you at the beginning, that we have to have a work plan for the remainder of the year. So one of the things that I'm going to ask members of the committee is, let's be mindful. We are going to have a number of items at every single committee meeting. We're not going to have in the future 2 or 3 items as we are having today. Probably we're going to have 8, 10 items to complete what's within attachment 1. So any additional pressures that you're going to put on staff by asking for more reports, someone has to give in as well to other askings. So let's be mindful about that. And on that, I really want to thank city staff for coming forward with something that it was extremely important, and this given the direction that we need. And I'm hoping that other standing committees council will do the same, because this is important to do. Thank you. And I would like to move the recommendations before us to receive them. All those in favor? Against? Carry. Thank you. Now we have the last item. A communication, it was an email from Councilor Karygiannis, and I think that there is a motion that you have, and can we display that, the motion, please?
need to introduce this item.
First, it has to be, the item has to be introduced, and it is marked as LS 8.4. Does everyone have this item? Okay, so let's wait for 1 minute. So the communication from Councilor Carichanes, it's being noted as LS 8.4, and this communication needs to be introduced. So can I have a motion for the introduction of this item? Councilor De Vermeer, all those in favor? Against? Carry. Okay, so it's been introduced. So now there is a motion to, you have a motion, Councilor James, on this? Eh? Yeah. And I did consult with city staff and mainly with the legal department, and I believe that you are okay with this motion. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. The motion reads that the city solicitor, in consultation with appropriate staff, report to the License and Plans Committee on January the 22nd, 2016, on the outcome of the recent Calgary Court injunction and the implications, if any, for the City of Toronto's enforcement activities with respect to unlicensed ground transportation providers.
Thank you. All those in favor? Against?
Can we have a recorded vote, please, Chair? If I may.
All those in favor? Councilor De Vermeer, Di Giorgio, Carichanes. Against? Malo and Palacio. Carry. I need a motion to adjourn. Councilor Malo, all those in favor? Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
That's quick. Yeah, you can, hey,